On behalf of Vilniaus University Confucius Institute, welcome you to this very special event. It's my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful, funny guest, Jiexi Appell, who is not only a specialist of Asian studies and Chinese language, but has a very unique talent to make Chinese people laugh. And I really do hope that it will work with us Lithuanians too. So, Jiexi, floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Vilma, and thank you all for coming. Hello, ni hao, labas vakaras. Did I say that right? There we go. Thank you. That's the only Lithuanian I know, so if you want more, you'll be disappointed. I'm so happy that we have so many people here. I walked into this room to see what it was like, and it was absolutely beautiful, but I was worried if no one shows up that I would just have to perform for these people up there. I'm like, they don't look like they're very funny. So it's very good to be here. I'm so excited to be able to share my journey through Chinese comedy with you all. As a little bit of an introduction, I'm from America. You can probably tell from my accent. I grew up in Boston in the United States, and then when I was in high school, I started learning Chinese. And I was really excited to learn Chinese, and I'm like, oh, this is going to be really new. And then when I showed up to my Chinese class in high school, all of the students, well, let's say half of the students were Chinese people. And I was like, what's happening? And it turns out that their parents made them go to high school Chinese class to learn to read and write. So I would be trying to learn Chinese, like, ni hao, and in the board, people would be in the back talking in fluent Chinese. And so it was a little bit of a journey from there to here. But I started learning Chinese, and then when I graduated from university, I moved to Beijing and started to become a Chinese comedian. But I was in China for so long that my reactions, even now, are still in Chinese. So if you startle me, I'm like, what? I speak in Chinese. And normally that's not a problem, but recently I was back in the United States. I was in a restaurant, and I used the bathroom. I was in the bathroom. A guy comes over and knocks on the door. He's like, is anybody in there? Anybody in there? And I just go like, yo, rent? No. And then I realized, like, oh, I should add some English. So I'm like, someone's in here. And then the moment I said it, I realized I made a big mistake, because that guy now thinks there's two people in here. I'm going to be given a little talk today. It's going to be in 3 parts. First part, talk about xiàngsheng, the traditional comedy. Second part, I'll show you some tips that I learned while living in China that might help you if you ever go to China or another country. And then in the third part, I'm going to talk about my work now on the internet, now that the world is kind of closed off a little bit, how I continue to use comedy as a way to bridge the cultures between China and the rest of the world outside of China. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A. If anybody has any questions, I'm super happy to talk with you guys as long as you want. I flew all the way here to hang out with you guys tonight. So I'm going to show you a little clip of me performing Chinese comedy on TV. And hopefully everybody can see the subtitles clearly enough to be able to get some of the jokes.
谢谢。接下来上场这位嘉宾呢是一个外国人，他在中国呢待了不短的时间。那最近他的身边又发生了哪些趣事儿？来，让我们欢迎艾杰西。
大家好，我叫艾杰西。先自我介绍吧，我叫艾杰西啊，大家都看成我上来就听到我的声音，都知道我不是北京人，我不是北京，我是东北人，我真的是东北人，对，我是美国东北的，对，老家是波士顿那嘎达，对。今天的主题是算什么男人，所以我以为什么是男人呢？我觉得男人就是能实现自己的理想，就是一个男人。所以我最早就是我有一个梦想，就是我要当一个脱口秀演员。然后，但是我的中国朋友都知道我是一个什么全职的脱口秀演员，中国的脱口秀演员。他们会问，哎，那你父母怎么想呢？所以我上次回国的时候，我也问了我爸，我说，哎，爸，我做中国的脱口秀演员，你有什么想法？然后他回了一句 ，Speak English。 Yeah, so you can get a little bit of an idea of what the comedy, what sort of things that people laugh at. And in addition to that, though, I also did the traditional comedy, and I want to take the first bit of the talk to talk about this traditional comedy that I did. It's called xiàngsheng. Xiàngsheng, in English, we usually call it crosstalk. And the way that xiàngsheng works is that we have two people on stage. You have two people on stage, they go back and forth in this scripted dialogue, but also if they're good comedians, they can kind of improvise, and if the audience laughs or coughs or whatever, they can interact with the audience as well. I studied with Master Ding. This is my comedy master, Master Ding. He's the only master that took foreign disciples. And so I studied with him from 2012 when I started my Fulbright until he passed away in 2018. But I learned how to perform everywhere. Performed in, my friend's living room. Anywhere we could get a chance to perform, we would perform. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what the traditional comedy looks like. This is a clip of me performing with my comedy master. And in this clip, we've told the audience that I've just returned from America, where I started a Beijing opera group. So you kind of see, you get kind of a little bit of a back and forth feeling. There's two roles on stage. There's the Dougen, who's on the left side, and the Penggen. The Dougen is a joker, and then the Penggen is like the straight man. So there's one crazy person and one normal person. And then what the audience knows this, so that when they see the person on the left, they already know they're going to be a little bit crazy, and the person on the right is going to be a little bit serious. And so they actually have comedy routines that use this knowledge to do special things. Like there's one routine I learned that was called Lun Peng Dou, which is discussing, joking, and straight man. And the idea behind this is that the joker comes on, and he's like, oh, it's much harder to be the joker. And the straight man goes like, no, it's much harder to be the straight man. And then they get into a fight about whether it's harder to be a joker or a straight man. And then in order to prove each other wrong, they switch roles on stage and then sabotage each other. So the whole piece is a giant train wreck, and nothing is funny, but everything is funny because the people know that the joker's supposed to be on the left and the straight man's supposed to be on the right. The xiàngsheng actually came originally as a street performance art. What happened was in the Qing dynasty in the 1800s, one of the Qing emperors died, and they forbid any Beijing opera from being performed for what turned out to be 2 years. But all the Beijing opera performers had no job. They needed to find a way to make a living. And the clowns from the Beijing opera went onto the street and started telling jokes. And one guy was so good at telling jokes that he actually got famous enough to be invited to the Forbidden City to perform for the Empress Dowager Cixi. And he did so well at that show that it became known that the Empress loved this type of comedy. And so that person became very famous, and he took a disciple. And he realized that if we have two people, we can speak even louder, and we can go back and forth and back and forth, and we can do all sorts of great comedy. And then that person took a disciple, and then that person took a disciple. And so we actually have a special thing in Chinese comedy, which is this master-student relationship that you don't have in American comedy. There's a formal apprenticeship, and you get written into the family tree. So I'm a member of the 8th generation of xiàngsheng performers. Master Ding was a member of the 7th generation, and then his master, Hou Baolin, was the biggest Chinese comedian of the last 100 years. So there's a wax statue of Hou Baolin, my master's master, in the Wax Museum, Madame Tussauds in Beijing. If you talk to any Chinese person about xiàngsheng, they'll say, oh, I know xiàngsheng, 4 words, 说学逗唱. 说学逗 and 唱 are speak, study, joke, and sing. And these are the 4 skills that we learned. So when I learned how to do Chinese comedy, we would learn how to use each of these skills to make the audience laugh. And the first skill is 说, which is speaking, because it's a comedy show. So in order to speak, you need to speak not just fluently, but you need to speak well enough to attract the audience's attention. So if I were to say in normal Chinese, I am a xiàngsheng performer, if I was just talking to somebody, I would say, 我是一个相声演员. But if I'm a xiàngsheng performer, I have to bring some energy to it. So I have to say, 我是一个相声演员, to be able to project your voice and bring in the audience through the way that you talk. A guangkou is a short monologue, which is usually a very fast, very complicated thing to say. And by showing off the speaking ability, it draws the audience in. So I'm going to perform one of these guangkou for you. It's called the dilitu, or the map. And it's a whole bunch of different country names, one after the other. So it goes like this. It goes like this. 太平洋、印度洋、大西洋、北冰洋、欧洲、亚洲、非洲、美洲、大洋洲、东亚、南亚、西亚、东南亚、韩国、朝鲜、蒙古、日本、越南、印度、缅甸、老挝、新加坡、菲律宾、尼泊尔、印度尼西亚、孟加拉、亚美尼亚、斯里兰卡、冰岛、丹麦、瑞典、芬兰、波兰、捷克、德国、法国、奥地利、乌克兰、爱尔兰、小利尼亚、三夫、摩尔多瓦、比利时、山地亚、多耶、瓦雷尔亚、阿尔巴尼亚，还有贝宁、埃及、多哥、刚果、马利、汤加、科莫罗、摩洛哥、冈比亚、赞比亚、赤道、肯尼亚、阿拉斯加、新西兰、萨尔瓦多、尼加拉瓜、洪都拉斯、美国、墨西哥、美国、加拿大，还有立陶宛。The second technique is 学 or imitate. So just like in Western comedy, in like a stand-up comedy show, you imitate all the people in your life. So if I was doing a joke about me and my mom, I wouldn't go and say, and then my mom asked me, how come you don't have a job? And I said, it's hard to get a job. And then my mom said, why is it hard? You don't just say it, you imitate all the people, like, why can't you get a job? It's not easy to get a job. It's not that hard. You play the people. And so one of the ways that I use this 学 technique is I have a joke about how, what it's like to be a white guy in America that speaks Chinese. Because in China, it kind of makes sense I speak Chinese, but in America, the number of people that look like me and speak Chinese is like 0. So that means I can totally mess with Chinese tourists. Like, they have no idea what's happening. So one time I was in New York, and I saw a bunch of Chinese tourists taking pictures of the buildings. And so I don't know why, I just went up behind one of them. I was like, wow, and they turned around like... I could have sworn there was like a Beijing cab driver behind me. And it's just me on my phone like, no, I can't go, I'm sorry, I can't do it. So that transition from being like, hi everybody, I'm Jesse, like, that transition is using the 学 or the imitation technique. Do is joking. This is Guo, and he's probably the biggest comedian in China right now. This guy is unbelievable. He sells out like 20,000, 30,000 seats. He's like big comedian. And I always get a little bit upset when I look at him because like I work really hard to be funny and he just looks funny, like I don't feel like he's working, right? He's just being himself. So one of the things I was interested in when I went over to research comedy was I had a feeling that what we joke about would be different, but I was very curious about the how. Like, is the technique of performing comedy similar between the West and China? And I found out that my Shifu, my master, had actually written a book in which he listed all of the ways that the Chinese comedians get people to laugh. So there's puns, there's metaphors, there's exaggerations, yada, yada, yada. There's the breaking norms, self-contradiction, yada, yada, yada. You don't need to know all these. But my point in showing you this is that a lot of this stuff is funny everywhere. It looks a little weird back in English, strange combination of circumstances, absurd exaggeration, juxtaposition. But they all kind of work in the West. And so what makes the Chinese comedy different is kind of like how much of each of the skills you use. Like how exaggerated is too exaggerated. And then finally, the fourth skill is chang, which is singing. So this comes from the fact that there was a Beijing opera background. The first comedians were Beijing opera performers, and so they incorporated the famous Beijing operas of the time into their comedy. And so this technique still comes down to the modern day. So one of the advantages of having this master-to-student relationship is that they have what they call traditional pieces that are jokes and routines, big comedy routines that have been passed down master to student for like 150 years. And so I learned some of these old comedy routines when I was doing them. But part of the skill of doing old comedy now is you have to kind of mix it up a little bit. So one of the routines that I learned that had Beijing opera in it, I showed you a clip from before where I said Americans love Beijing opera. That piece is called Cheng Sangguo, Singing the Three Kingdoms. And my master and I are on stage, and he'll say like, oh, you like Beijing opera? I like Beijing opera. What Beijing opera did you sing in America? And I said, oh, in America we did Three Kingdoms opera. He's like, oh, Three Kingdoms. I love the Three Kingdoms. Let's do some Three Kingdoms opera. And so we start to work together, but it turns out that he's thinking of the Three Kingdoms of Wei, Shu, and Wu, and I'm thinking of the Three Kingdoms of America, Mexico, and Canada. So it gets a little complicated. If you were to do it here, you could do Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. I'm sure it would kill. So then we all try to start singing, and I know different words than him, and everybody gets frustrated, and he's like, Jesse, can you sing real Beijing opera? And I'm like, oh, I can sing real Beijing opera. It goes like this. 只动生马心不爽，山人八卦球儿得藏，将身且作中军长。等到涿州一得正蹭崔蹭。If we're learning languages and learning cultures, we've come into a great age. Google Translate can help us learn the words even easier. We can learn how to say desk and microphone and screen and all of these things. But what we really need to be focusing on is like stories. It's on stories, on culture, on how to build trust and to make friends. And we build trust and make friends by learning about each other and just being interested and trying to follow where that interest leads. And so it leads me to think a lot about the nature of a lot of cultural misunderstanding, is that a lot of times culture is like a mirror. And if our knowledge of another culture is a little bit warped, then what we see coming back at us looks kind of scary, even though it wasn't really scary when it was sent out. And so some cultural issues really are really difficult to solve. But a lot of cultural issues may look more like the one that we just had, where you see Chinese people going, 大宋朝文彦博幼儿道幼, and they're like, okay, they're doing their thing. That looks pretty different. But actually, if you kind of know why they're saying what they're saying, you can oftentimes find a way to do your own version of it, and it really works just as well. And so that's why, after being in China for so long, the secret of doing comedy in another culture is there's stuff that Chinese people know, there's stuff that Westerners know, and then right in the middle, there's this big lol section. And so I like to try to live in the lol section and make people laugh. I also want to give some tips, some warm tips to everybody for operating abroad. Because I know that in Europe it's a little bit more, the countries are closer together, you might travel to other countries very frequently, but there's also countries that are very far away like China, and if you ever go to China, or you can use these tips for going to another culture, I want to share a little bit of what I've learned. The first tip is what I call there are two sides of time abroad. One side is the Pepsi underwear side of time abroad. That's when I walked into a supermarket in China, and I found that they sold Pepsi underwear, and I wondered why. But nobody came by to tell me. And so this is what I like to call the other side of time abroad, is the panoramic view of my homework side of time abroad, which is to say, in order to understand the Pepsi underwear, you must first understand the culture that created the Pepsi underwear. And so that led me to what I call the magic China formula, which is whatever it is what you like to do, plus how they do that in China, is you're basically the only person doing it. So I like comedy, and I like making people laugh. And when I went to China, I realized there's like 5 people in the history of China that were not from China that really tried to make people laugh. And so this is what I always tell the students that are learning Chinese. It's like, whatever it is you like to do. If you like sneakers, there are people that like sneakers in China. If you like, skateboarding, there's people that like skateboarding. If you like whatever, saunas, there's a sauna culture in China. Go find it out, and you'll be the only person who's doing that. And that is kind of what I've used to create my career over there. And I want to share a little bit about what's happening recently, because I learned xiàngsheng back in China, and then recently there's obviously with the pandemic, the borders have been closed. It's getting harder and harder to do cultural exchange with China. And so what I've learned is that I'm trying to take what I learned about being this people-to-people exchange that I did in China, real people meeting real people. How do we do that now over the internet? Because the truth about a lot of the internet is that it has this amazing power to be able to bring us together. And especially now for the United States, and you guys as well in Lithuania, we're in bad times with relations with China. So in that sort of situation, I thought it was very important to look back and say, what did we do when it was going good? And then how can we get things back to a better place? And so what this is that people-people relations allow big ideas on cooperation between countries to manifest as real-life friendships. And then those real-life friendships help to stabilize international cooperation when things are in tension. And so what I'm thinking is that we need sort of a new ping-pong diplomacy, but it's not going to be ping-pong, it's going to be something on the internet. The cool thing about doing this online is it really changes the way we think about ambassadors, because again, the ambassador used to be a person that spoke for the whole country. But nowadays, anybody with a cell phone really has the ability to reach huge amounts of people. And so what this means is we basically democratize diplomacy. Diplomacy now means whatever it is that you want it to mean, and you have the tool in your hand to be able to do that. It also means that we have the ability to scale diplomacy. Before, if we had a cultural event, I can come to this room for one show, but because we're recording it, now we can send it anywhere. We can send it all over the world. And so it's not to say that we shouldn't do real in-person relations, but we should also remember that everything we do is an opportunity to share it with even more people who couldn't come to here on the internet. I think at the end of the day, the way I look at it is that we want to be the meme you want to see on your feed. So thank you all so much for listening. I'm Jesse Appell. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.